Hey everybody, this is Erica. I'm back with a second video about the historical development of the Bible, and this one is going to be about the canonization process. So I'm going to see if I can share a video with you. Here we go. So we can think of this as happening in two stages. One, and really the longer one, is that texts gather over time and they become important in a specific community. So they gain authority, they come to be considered holy. For the most part, we don't see the beginnings of this process because it probably happens gradually. Instead, what we see are these moments where we get some evidence that it has happened, that certain books have acquired this status. The second thing is that there are texts that are limited. That is, a canon becomes closed. And it seems like there are, for both the Old and the New Testament, certain texts that are shoo-ins that seem to have no debate about whether they're part of the canon, and then a certain number that are late comers that are more debated, and so we'll see what those are as we go on. So this process of gaining authority is neither completely top-down nor bottom-up. The texts are definitely written, compiled, promulgated by an intelligentsia. It is writing is in this period of time mostly done by a fairly small group of people. But then the writing is shared in communities that have a much broader range of social classes and ethnicity and groups, especially once Christianity is the context we're talking about. This is happening throughout the Mediterranean world. And it's largely this use over time and in faith communities that gives the text weight and then staying power. And at the same time, it's through bishops and authorities who are also going to be male that make the sort of final decisions. So just to say, it's not all one or the other. So first, let's think about the Old Testament. This in Jewish tradition is called the Tanakh. And the Tanakh is an acronym for the three major sections that it's comprised of: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. The Torah is, the reason I'm talking about this is that these sort of represent a hierarchy that describes both the status that each of these groupings had and the order in which they became authoritative. So the Pentateuch, or the Torah, was given that canonical status first. The rabbis believed that it was written first or given first. I think modern scholars would probably disagree somewhat with that, but we would all agree that it has this status quite early. The Torah is also called the Pentateuch, Penta for 5, and that's the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And we see very early that these are the writings for which there are the fewest variations from, when I say early, I mean like Dead Sea Scrolls time. So this is not early in the writing process, early in the period when we are still seeing textual variations in the other ones. So once a text really becomes authoritative, you see fewer textual variants, different communities having different versions, although there still are small differences from one community to another. The next in the hierarchy with a little less authority is this group called the prophets. And although it's called the prophets, it includes books that in Protestant Bibles are things we think of as the historical books, which is Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, plus the books you would think of as the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, plus what in Jewish tradition was called the Book of the 12, the quote minor prophets. So they were next in order and slightly more fluid. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a version of Isaiah that's a little different from the canonical version, and you see parts of the text that are still fluid and still being reworked, and they can be reworked because they're not quite as well established as the Pentateuch was at that time. Next, we have this grouping called the writings, and here is where most of the debates that we get any access to, I think in the Mishnah, but these are the ones where if there's any debate over what would be included in the canon, what was sort of holy enough or written early enough to be included in the canon, this is where it happened. So this is a book of sort of miscellaneous writings. It includes Psalms, it includes the wisdom literature of Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. It includes what in Jewish tradition are the festival scrolls. So that's Song of Songs, Ruth, Esther, Lamentations. And in Jewish tradition, it also includes Daniel, even though in the Christian Bible, that's considered a prophetic book. And then finally, there are these books that later tradition would call Apocrypha, but these are books that include Judith, Bel and the Dragon, the books of Maccabees, the, they're escaping me, right, Sirach or Ben Sira. So they're books that were also included, but they have a lower status still. We see evidence that these had come together into a canon, a Jewish canon of some kind, not yet in all of those groupings, but in the Septuagint. So the Septuagint, which is abbreviated LXX, which stands for the 70, there's a legend that there were 70 translators who all came up with the same translation at the same time. This is a Greek translation of Jewish texts that probably dates to sometime between 250 and 150 BCE. It's so in order to be translated, they have to be collected. So sort of here we have a collection. And this significantly includes both the books that are in modern Hebrew Bibles and books that are in what Protestants call the Apocrypha. And this becomes the basis of the Christian Old Testament. This is referenced as scripture in the New Testament. And we also see reference in the New Testament to these groupings of the law and the prophets, not the writings, but the law and the prophets. So there seems to be a basic kind of proto-canon of Jewish scripture, you know, before the time of Jesus, but definitely in the time of Jesus. And yet it's not a closed canon in the modern sense of no other writings being written at all. We also see some evidence for a canon, a proto-canon in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are not, I mean, this is a collection of scrolls that includes both biblical texts and non-biblical texts. So it's not like they had one cache and it was a Bible. There were instead like an Isaiah scroll, and then scrolls that belonged to a community that were unique to that community so far as we know. But what is significant about this find was that they're the earliest manuscripts we have for the Hebrew Bible by 1,000 years. Until they were discovered, the oldest manuscripts that existed were from about 1,000 CE. So here we've got BCE, probably, manuscripts. And what they show us is that there are these variants where we can detect the kinds of patterns of what texts were still fluid at that time and what texts seem to be pretty fixed. They also tell us how much or how little change there seems to be for both the Septuagint and, when I say Hebrew traditions, what this is usually referred to in scholarly circles is the Masoretic text, to the text that is transmitted and then becomes the basis of the Hebrew Jewish Bible. And it looks like there are that some of the things that we had assumed had become corrupted in the Septuagint actually are witnessed by very early traditions, but they seem to be several different text families. So not surprisingly, in an age before printing presses, texts were not standardized in a central place. Where they're copied by hand, there may be copies that are different from place to place. And so the Septuagint and the Masoretic texts are following kind of some different textual traditions. However, I think most lay people would find most of the differences pretty minor. If you're a scholar, there would be a few places where even a minor difference might have major implications. And there are a few places where there are some pretty significant chunks in Esther and some parts of Samuel and Kings. But I would say it's probably not going to be changes that would make you think of a Da Vinci Code kind of somebody hiding something. Unfortunately, that would be exciting, but I don't think it's the case. So that said, there is still some debate on the status of some books, and these are probably sort of the latest of these books and the ones that are sort of the most questioned of the writings until maybe the 2nd century CE. So this is now 2nd century CE. So this is later than the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in addition, I think it's important to note that these exist alongside other Bible-like writings. And in the time of Jesus, these sort of Bible emulating kinds of tradition would also have been around and known by some interpreters of scripture. So there are these extra canonical works. Some are written and some are oral. There is rabbinic tradition about what's called oral Torah. And these would have influenced the understanding that people who are really involved in interpreting Scripture would have had about their understanding of Scripture and of God. And I think this will become especially significant in thinking about messianic expectation. So I may talk about that a little bit before the next residency. Some of these writings, most of them not this old, but some of these writings may go back to as far as 400 BCE. So some of these writings are as old or older than the ones that do get canonized. So there's some interesting stuff in there. And the oldest one is probably the Book of Enoch. So these are less weighty than the law, the prophets, and certainly they're more important in some groups. Remember, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are these texts that only exist there that we know of. So there are these different sects. But I think it's also fair to think about this line between Scripture and non-Scripture probably being a lot less clear than it is now. So at any rate, in Jesus's time, there is this body that is thought of as Scripture, but it's what we now call the Old Testament. You know, it's Jewish scriptures. Now, books are limited for a couple of reasons. There's one question, is the book holy enough? But then there's this other question, is it heretical? Is it contradicting something that's already in there? We kind of tend to think of this, the second one is the main reason that a book would not make the cut. But actually, most of the debate is about the first question. Is the book holy enough? Has it gained enough of a status? And as we'll see, there's some other criteria for what has to be true. So originally, of course, the Christian writings aren't scripture. They're written for specific communities. The Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke is really sort of written as Luke Acts, are sort of drawing on earlier sources. Those are each written to different communities. John is to a different community. And then certainly the letters of Paul are addressed to specific communities and often in specific circumstances. There are sometimes crises in these communities that Paul is addressing. Here I have listed the letters that most scholars agree are genuinely from Paul and to these communities. That's, I wrote Philippians twice, sorry. But both of the Corinthian letters, 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, that should have been Philemon, actually, and Romans. And initially, these are just written and read in these communities, but pretty quickly, they start to circulate. Copies of them start to circulate to other Christian communities, especially after Paul is martyred and becomes a really important founding figure. As they're circulated, as they form into collections, other writings appear, and these writings sometimes claim to be written by Paul and by other early apostles. So you have writings that came to be thought to be written by Paul, so Ephesians, Colossians, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Timothy, but which scholars now think were written later by someone claiming to be written by Paul. You have also the letter of James, which is supposed to be from the brother of Jesus, I'm actually not sure what scholarship thinks about the authenticity of whether it really could be that early, but that is a supposed author. And then books like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter, which are both Gnostic texts, the Apocalypse of John, which we call Revelation, which in ancient times was ascribed to the Apostle John, probably thought now to be just a different John. But there's a host of other extra canonical writings that sort of claim to be written by one of the apostles. And so they're going to start discerning which have the highest status. By the 2nd century, what we see is that despite these early writings being directed at specific communities, now there are multiple gospels that are read together, as well as the letters of Paul, some letters of Paul, and they're being treated as scripture on par with Jewish scripture. So evidence of this we see from Polycarp around 125 CE, where he quotes a passage from Ephesians as scripture, and Ephesians is probably one of the letters that is in Paul's name, but that Paul did not write. So already that is being treated as scripture. Also, Justin, who is martyred and therefore called Justin Martyr, around 160, describes reading what he calls the memoirs of the apostles. I find it really fascinating that one of the reasons that the different gospels, the different versions of Jesus' life were all elevated and thought to be sacred is because they were understood as the memoirs of the apostles. And he says that they are read alongside the prophets, which would be the Jewish writings of the prophets, and read in Christian worship, which apparently is the sort of mark of canon, of being canonical. So I found this really interesting, this passage. This is one of the places where we get an early list of what books were considered canonical. It's called the Muratorian Fragment. It is a fragment, but it's early, so it's a really cool piece of evidence. So this is 170 to 175 CE. So there's this book called The Shepherd of Hermas, this writing called The Shepherd of Hermas that was held in very high regard. And he's writing about why it should not be considered on par with other texts he was calling scripture. He says, but Hermas wrote The Shepherd most recently in our time in the city of Rome, while Bishop Pius, his brother, was occupying the chair of the church of the city of Rome. And therefore, it ought indeed to be read, but it cannot be read publicly to the people in church, either among the prophets whose number is complete, or among the apostles, for it is after their time. So this gives us this really interesting window into how the boundaries of the canon were being thought of and what it meant to consider a text scripture. So this writing, The Shepherd, was not controversial for being heretical or anything like that. It ought indeed to be read, but it was not on the same level. And what it meant to be scriptural was that it could be read publicly to the people in church, and that was done among the prophets, meaning along with other writings in the Jewish prophets considered scriptural, right? And here we see that how they're thinking about the boundaries of the canons. The number of the prophets is complete, which means it's a closed canon, and it perhaps is understood to have a number that is significant. and therefore it's a number you can't mess with. Or among the apostles, for it is after their time. So the amount of the apostles is bounded because it should be early. This idea of whether or not Christians use the Hebrew scriptures as their own was really pushed by this controversy that surrounded a guy named Marcion in the late 2nd century. He is a Turkish Christian, and around the year 144, he preaches that Christ's true nature is divine and eternal, meaning it is not human, and that Christ had no connection to the Jewish God of the Old Testament. So Marcion is classified along with some of the Gnostics, and I'll talk about them a little bit in a minute. But so he proposes a canon that consists only of 10 Pauline letters and one gospel that is something like Luke. And he especially rejects the Old Testament. And this movement continues to have strong enough adherents that 50 years after his death, we're still getting a rejection. But it's Marcion that is popular enough and radical enough to force other Christian leaders to take a position on what is and isn't Christian scripture. And it's in response to him that Christian bishops affirm what Marcion had rejected. That is, that the Old Testament, that 4 Gospels, and not just one, and the pastoral letters are scripture, and then this becomes an Orthodox position. Now, there's going to continue to be some controversy about some of the pastoral letters, but certainly the Old Testament and what we saw referred to as the prophets is henceforward going to be considered Christian scripture. The exact contents are going to be continued to be debated. So the New Testament really, so that was 2nd to 3rd century. It still takes another century to get the exact list agreed upon by everyone. The first list that describes what is in the 24 books of the New Testament that we have now comes from the Alexandrian Bishop Athanasius in the year 367. Now, there are a couple of other lists throughout the 4th century that are similar and not exactly the same. So we know there continues to be a little bit of debate, but most of that debate is over the inclusion or exclusion of 6 books. And I would say actually most of it is about 2 or 3. And these, again, are not disputed because they have controversial theology, except for maybe Revelation, because it was thought to be pretty violent. So there are some objections there on the basis of content. But most of the debate was about whether they were really written by the people to whom they were traditionally ascribed. And it seems to have been a criterion at that point that they have an author who was either an apostle or of that generation. I want to say a word about the Gnostic heresies because there's sort of a lot of popular conception that there was a grand conspiracy to keep these out of the canon and things would have been so much better if they had been in there. So there's a lot of unknowns here, but a lot of this has been sort of romanticized. So I just want to say a little bit about them. So Gnosticism is not what they themselves would have called what they believe. They would have said they're Christians. But this is a scholarly term that groups together several different groups, and what is the common thread between them is that they have theology that revolves around gnosis or knowledge, and they believe that one is saved by having the correct knowledge of the way the universe is put together. And they're pretty esoteric, and some of them are pretty dualistic and really reject the physical world. They're mostly known from their opponents, but they're also known from a group of Gnostic texts, which are called the Nag Hammadi Library, after where they were discovered. And they were written 3rd or 4th century. Well, that's when the manuscripts are from. They may have been copied from works that were composed earlier than that, but they were discovered in Egypt in 1945. So they had been buried for a long, long time, like almost 1,500 years, over 1,500 years probably. The origins of Gnostic groups and texts are not clear. They may have been as early as the early Christian writings. Elaine Pagels, who has written a lot about these, theorizes that the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of John were sort of written in dialogue with each other, but I'm not sure that a lot of other scholars will buy into that, and many of them think that the Gnostic texts are mostly later than the Gospels, but probably are written by the end of the 2nd century. They were very prolific writers, and if you think about a group that are going to be mostly oriented around knowledge, they're probably people who are thinkers and scholars, maybe. So they wrote a lot for their size, though most of those writings are now lost. They were declared heretical, but notice here, the most famous people who declared them heretical are Irenaeus and Tertullian, and that is late 2nd, early 3rd century, but they don't actually die out until the 4th century. So it can't only be opposition to bishops who call them heretical that accounts for the decline of Gnosticism, because they're declared heretical and then they still hang around. It may be that there's more opposition once Constantine wants to have a more unified empire and set of creeds. It also may be that they are not a very big group to begin with. They sort of base themselves on having a pretty exclusive small theology. So it's not clear, but it may be that they were just a little too weird for most of the rest of Christianity. But early Christianity is more diverse than it becomes after it becomes Constantinian. So there is another really big change that doesn't happen until the Protestant Reformation. So until the Protestant Reformation, the Bible is in Latin. And it is Luther who translates the Bible into a vernacular language, into German. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the next video. And his German Bible, which appears in 1522, groups these books. So here are the books into a single section. They had been kind of in different places, but he puts the books of Tobit, Judith, 1 and 2 Maccabees, the Book of Wisdom, Sirach, and Baruch together into a single section. He puts it at the back of the Old Testament, and he gives it this heading: Apocrypha, that are books which are not considered equal to the Holy Scriptures, but are useful and good to read. So again, he is not calling them heretical, but he is definitely assigning them a lower status. Now, part of the reason he chooses these books is that these books are not in Hebrew scriptures, and he considers them sort of not original, that these were sort of innovations of a church that was adding things that shouldn't be added. He actually, interestingly enough, wanted to eliminate a couple of New Testament books, James, Jude, Revelation, and I forget which else, one other one. But anyways, he was kind of vetoed on that because here's an example where the popular vote kind of overturned something from above. But he does set an important precedent with this, because most other Protestant Bibles, including English translations, kind of follow suit in calling this set of books Apocrypha, and including it in the back of the Old Testament as apocryphal, meaning secondary. So some Protestant Bibles now don't include it at all, and I would venture to say most Protestants don't know these books. So in response to this, the Catholic Church met at a Council of Trent to answer Luther, and to answer Luther on his treatises and his charges and all of these other things, but also on the question of canon. And in 1546, they reaffirm the canon they have that includes these books in the order they have them. And so this is why today there are different Protestant and Catholic canons. The Jewish canon is also a little bit different. The Orthodox canon varies slightly from that. So there's a little bit of variation in order, in books, etc. And if you would like to see a more detailed set of these, I am including this link, which I hope you'll be able to see. If not, I'm hoping I can put it in the video. So that's it for that section, and I have one more short one on dissemination. See you then.